where blood and sand mingled in one of the most iconic conflicts in modern history. 3 decades ago, the world witnessed the roar of tanks echoing through the desert in a deadly duel that still resonates in the hearts and minds of survivors. The Night of Terror haunts Gulf War veterans to this day, bringing forth physical and emotional scars that refuse to fade. Join us as we delve into the hidden secrets and untold stories behind this epic global showdown. Get ready to dive into the shadows of war and unravel the mysteries of a battle that will never be forgotten. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to stay tuned for more astonishing stories from General Jack. The fiercest tank battle in the history of warfare did not take place against the Nazis in Europe or in North Africa, but rather just 3 decades ago, in the deserts of Iraq. The military operation known as Desert Storm, with its ground offensive dubbed Operation Desert Saber, lasting 6 weeks, featured a brutal campaign between tanks that rivaled even the historic Battle of Kursk in World War II. At Kursk, about 6,000 German and Soviet tanks engaged in relentless combat over an exhausting 6-week period. Gregory Fontenot, a retired colonel and historian who led a tank battalion during the most intense hours of Desert Storm, described a violent night that became known as the Night of Terror by its participants. Kursk was bigger if we consider the entire campaign, Fontenot says, but there was no other battle, before or after Desert Storm, where more than 3,000 tanks, along with thousands of other armored vehicles, fought for about 36 hours. In 3 epic clashes, dubbed Eastward 73, Mountainous Region of Medina, and Night of Terror, officially known as the Battle of Norfolk, massive armored vehicles on both sides relentlessly faced off, turning the vast desert into the most tank-concentrated battlefield in history. For the millions of Americans glued to their television screens in late February 1991, the news from Kuwait was extraordinarily triumphant. Allied forces were completely eliminating the troops of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, reclaiming their positions and driving them out of Kuwait, the small oil-rich country invaded by Hussein's army in August of the previous year. News broadcasts showcased images of Allied tank fleets advancing through the desert like a herd of buffaloes, defeating Russian-made Iraqi tanks and reducing them to rubble amidst clouds of fire and smoke. Supposedly, crowds of Iraqi soldiers surrendered without putting up a fight. Grim images of charred Iraqi bodies, with hands twisted in agony from the burns, seem to serve as stark lessons about the risks of defying the power of the world's forces of good. When it all ended, less than 100 hours after the start of the final offensive, news viewers heard the casualty count: 292 coalition soldiers killed, compared to tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers. Sitting on their comfortable sofas, viewers exchanged glances and commented, "Oh well, it seemed easy." But it wasn't easy. From the moment Iraq invaded its smaller neighbor to the south on August 1, 1990, several nations condemned the action. In the following months, a massive military force of 35 nations led by the United States was assembled in neighboring Saudi Arabia. Although the stated goal of the military presence was to prevent Iraq from invading Saudi Arabia, it was no secret that if Iraq's occupation of Kuwait persisted, the coalition would attempt to drive Iraqi forces back to their own border.
Fontenot, sitting in his living room in Lansing, Kansas, asserts firmly, "We cannot reduce this war to 100 hours. It would be a disservice to the United States Air Force and the other military branches that initiated the attack against the Iraqis in January." In the background, a painting depicts 2 U.S. tanks advancing toward the observer, representing the Iraqi perspective. On January 17, 1991, the coalition launched a series of airstrikes against Iraq, targeting missile bases and other military installations. Simultaneously, ground troops in Saudi Arabia were gearing up for desert combat, while isolated skirmishes occurred along the border. By mid-February, the coalition's focus seemed to hone in on Kuwait City, the occupied nation's port capital. As warships gathered near the coast, the Iraqis were convinced that the imminent attack would come from there. However, while the Iraqis were fixated on the potential threat from the coast, the coalition was planning a bold maneuver. On February 24th, one of the largest tank forces ever assembled, over 3,000 tanks, along with thousands of armored vehicles and infantry soldiers, crossed the vast and poorly defended border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq to the west. General Norman Schwarzkopf devised an ambitious strategy he dubbed the left hook Shi. Coalition tanks would advance north into Iraq for a certain distance and then abruptly turn east, pushing toward the occupied Kuwait city, eliminating any enemy resistance along the way. Paul Souza, a former tank operator, gazes upon the imposing Abrams M1A1 tank with the affection of someone reuniting with an old friend. The vehicle, nearly 10 meters long and weighing nearly 68 tons, is more than just a machine to him. It's a cherished memory. This is my faithful companion, he smiles. I spent 18 years working with these vehicles. During the Desert Storm, I stayed inside this one for 100 straight hours, only stepping out for basic needs like using the restroom, assisting with refueling, or holding a machine gun while others refueled. In the battle, approximately 1.9 thousand of these machines were dispatched to confront the Iraqis. While the enemy possessed thousands of operational tanks of Soviet origin, nothing compared to the firepower available to Souza and his team, belonging to the 1st Cavalry Division. Today, modernized versions of the M1A1 are still used in various parts of the world. However, the specimen on display at the American Heritage Museum in Stowe, Massachusetts, with its over 6.2 thousand square meters, is the only tank of its kind open to the public worldwide. The crew of the M1A1 comprised a team of 4 soldiers, each playing a crucial role: the commander, the driver, the gunner, and the loader. Together, they referred to themselves as tank operators, an identity they carried with pride and tradition. Once a tank operator, always a tank operator, they used to say. At the top of the hierarchy, the commander occupied his elevated position, monitoring the surrounding territory attentively. Up front, the driver protruded his head from an opening just below the cannon. Meanwhile, whoever took the gunner's seat experienced the sensation of being immersed in the machine. There was no empty space, only a variety of equipment and ammunition compressed around the operator. Amidst memories, Paul Souza shares his experience. I spent the entire war in the dark, peering through the periscope. I felt somewhat hidden. In the early hours of February 24th, coalition forces secretly advanced along the border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, stretching for about 480 kilometers. Although Iraqi military officials had some suspicions, they took no action regarding them. Randy Richert, who served in the 1st Infantry Division, recalls with humor, "Even my mom noticed. She heard news about all the other divisions clustered near Kuwait, to the east, but nothing about us. So she told her friends, 'I think Randy is somewhere in the desert.'" Before the Desert Storm, many Army tank operators had spent almost a decade training on M1A1s in Europe, preparing for a possible Soviet invasion through the Iron Curtain. It was the Cold War era. Remembers gunner Paul Beaulieu. We were always on alert, always expecting a Soviet invasion. I never imagined I would end up applying the training somewhere in the desert, but I was prepared. As he walks around the M1A1 at the American Heritage Museum, Beaulieu highlights the tank's advanced suspension system, allowing for smooth movement even on the most rugged desert terrain. Pointing to an old Sheridan M551 tank from the 1960s, also used in the Desert Storm, he adds, "Compared to riding in that tank over there, it's like a Cadillac ride." Ironically, the Sheridan was produced by Cadillac. Don't forget to like and subscribe to General Jack's channel to stay updated on more fascinating stories like this. At dawn on the first morning, the tanks, accompanied by infantry and other armored vehicles, advanced against the Iraqi defenses, unwaveringly heading north, where they would encounter resistance. Unprepared, Iraqi soldiers, many forcibly conscripted by Saddam, faced the invasion with bravery, though significantly less equipped. Many surrendered as the tanks reached their encampments. However, these were not the elite of the Iraqi forces. They were merely pawns, positioned in broad front lines, facing the feared Iraqi Republican Guard. While in the United States, viewers witnessed footage of M1A1 tanks speeding through a dry desert under radiant sunshine. In reality, the weather in Iraq was harsh. Torrential rain swept the desert for much of the offensive. Worse yet, this rain was sticky and oily, a result of the precipitation of smoke from the oil fields of Kuwait set ablaze by the Iraqis. The swift success of the invasion caught even Schwarzkopf by surprise, leading him to order his troops to advance ahead of schedule. This decision bolstered the coalition's advantage, but exacted a high toll on the already exhausted troops. Sleeping was simply impossible, E. Richard recalls. If you stopped for a moment, you'd end up dozing off. At most, we could manage 20-minute naps over the following 8 hours. Don't forget to like and subscribe to General Jack's channel to stay updated on more fascinating stories like this.
At the outset of the operation, a series of tank skirmishes marked the first 2 days, but the true armored warfare began on February 26th. On that day, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment of the United States, along with other units, encountered tanks of the Republican Guard as they turned eastward toward Kuwait. In this confrontation, Troop A, led by the future National Security Advisor of the United States, Captain H.R. McMaster, took a strategic position above the dry bed of a river and, for 4 hours, faced successive waves of Iraqi tanks. In the adverse conditions of darkness, rain, and smoke, the situation became even more challenging. Tanks fired at each other, with Iraqi soldiers trying to find vulnerable points in coalition tanks to aim their machine guns. Meanwhile, tank operators closed their hatches for protection, while colleagues in nearby tanks repelled the invaders with machine gun fire, eliminating the intruders. The scene was illuminated by the trail of tracer bullets, with battles occurring in all directions. In rugged terrain, Iraqi fighters emerged from their hiding spots, aiming their bazookas at enemy tanks in an attempt to destroy them. The quick response of tank machine gunners prevented a potential disaster. At certain moments, Fontenot recounts, there was a line of tanks firing at each other. It was a 360-degree battle. In the midst of the confusion and darkness, inevitable tragedies occurred. Fontenot describes the terrifying moment when a U.S. Bradley infantry fighting vehicle was hit by an armor-piercing shell fired by an M1A1 tank, sending sparks flying into the air. Even though he had ordered his men not to shoot until they were absolutely certain of the target, Fontenot still laments the friendly fire of that chaotic night. 6 American soldiers were killed and 32 were wounded, victims of a combination of friendly and enemy fire. Fontenot explains, there were so many factors to consider. It was raining mud, my goodness. The clouds and smoke hindered visibility. Someone remarked that, on that night, visibility was so poor it was like looking into a closet with sunglasses on. Fatigue also played a crucial role, he notes. If fighters saw what they expected to see, even if there was nothing there. If they saw combat vehicles coming their way, they took actions that might not have been the most correct. Following the Night of Terror, there was one final major tank battle. A 40-minute clash in the mountainous region of Medina, involving about 3,000 vehicles, including 348 M1A1 tanks. It was the last bastion of resistance of the Iraqi Republican Guard, their ultimate battle in the brief war. Despite this, the range of the M1A1 cannons was so superior to that of the Iraqis that they could fire almost with impunity. Attack helicopters and A-10 anti-tank planes flew overhead to assist in the offensive. The victory in Medina was swift, decisive, and, for many Americans, traumatizing. My wife doesn't need to know what happened, confessed a tank operator to the New York Times. I don't want her to see that side of me. From the ceasefire violation, the battles of the Desert Storm lasted just under 100 hours. Between 25,000 and 50,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed and 80,000 were captured. Among the 219 American soldiers killed, 154 died in battle, many of them due to friendly fire. About 3,300 Iraqi tanks were destroyed in desert battles and airstrikes. The coalition lost 31 tanks. After the intense battles and the decisive victory in the mountainous region of Medina, soldiers returned to their camps exhausted but with a sense of duty fulfilled. The memories of the battle remained as scars in the minds of many, a vivid reminder of the brutality of war. As the dust settled in the desert, survivors faced a new challenge, dealing with trauma and moving forward. Many grappled with the ghosts of war, reliving moments of tension and the horror of the confrontations. Mutual support among veterans became essential to overcome the marks left by the battle. In the months that followed, the stories of the anonymous heroes of Desert Storm were told and retold, some becoming part of the official narrative, others shared in whispers in the corridors of military hospitals and at veterans' gatherings. For some, like the tank operator who didn't want his wife to know the details of what happened, silence was a form of protection, an attempt to shield their loved ones from the horrors of war. While the world celebrated the end of the conflict, for many veterans, the war was not yet over. They faced internal battles, struggling to find peace and meaning amidst the chaos and destruction they witnessed in the Iraqi desert. As time went on, Desert Storm veterans found different ways to cope with their experiences. Some found comfort in the camaraderie of their fellow soldiers, while others sought professional counseling to address the combat traumas. But all carried with them the indelible marks of war. As we remember the sacrifices and trials faced by these brave soldiers, it's important to honor their courage and commitment to peace. May their stories serve as a reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of reconciliation and compassion. If you enjoyed this story and want to keep up with the compelling narratives on the General Jack channel, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe so you don't miss any amazing stories. Together, we can honor the legacy of those who served and sacrificed for our freedom. Thank you for watching, and until the next story.